Make sure I have audio. Okay. All right. Are my slides up okay? Everything look good?
Looks good.
Good night in Maryland, Tom.
Okay,
Where-
thank you. Well, a lot of people are remoting their stations now, so I'm not doing anything that's out of the mainstream. And as you'll see, there are a lot of ways to do it. There's a lot of combinations of software and hardware that you can use to make that happen. So my effort is still a work in progress. I just thought I'd report on where we stand at the moment. So why do this at all? Well, it's one thing to just access your station remotely for rag chewing or even casual DXing, but making that operation good enough for contesting is harder. My main objectives are to make my station available for others to use, especially those who, aren't very well positioned to have decent antennas out, and also to have be able to do some multi-ops with the other operators remote. You can see Bob ND3D, who I think is on the call. I've had quite a few guys operate with me, but Bob and I go back to high school, and he is my mainstay hardcore operator. There's more than one way to approach the setup to do remote contesting. I'd say there's two main approaches, defined principally by where the logging computer is located. One option is to connect remotely to the radio, and you can do this using any of a number of hardware and or software solutions that allow you to get into your radio remotely. And then you do the logging at the remote site where the computer is. This is probably a good choice with a radio that could be remoted directly out of the box, something like a Flex, or when the K4 comes out, you can get into these radios directly over the internet. If you use this option, multi-ops would have to have several instances of the logging software running, and then you'd have to network them. And N1MM does have that capability to do that. I have not attempted to operate this way, but it is being done. The other approach is to have the shack computer directly connected to the radio and run the logging software there. Then the shack computer is accessed remotely using remote desktop software. The advantages of doing it this way is that there isn't any special hardware required on either end, and there's not a lot of software set up at the remote end. So the remote operators in this mode can basically just log in and go. W4RN, Mike has been doing this for a long time. He's gotten really good at it, and he has just been tremendously helpful in helping me get to do this. Regardless of which approach you use, there are some common issues that have to be addressed. First and foremost is that you need a reliable solution to get the audio from wherever the station is to the remote site. You have to be able to control or automate the operation of a lot of accessories, your antenna switching, rotators, and so forth. My station is set up to be started up and shut down remotely. You would think that would be easy, but it's not. It's actually pretty complicated, but it isn't really necessary to do what I like to do as long as someone is available to turn the station on locally. So I'd say that's optional, and I'm really not going to talk about some of the tricks of that trade. So here's the sort of the K3AJ approach. So we've sacrificed some flexibility and some functionality in the name of simplicity. Although simplicity is a relative term, as you'll see when I show how much hardware and software has to be configured to make this work. We use N1MM as our logger, and it has some pretty good internal capability to run the radio, and we basically rely on that. So you make band changes by pushing the band buttons in the entry window. The antenna switching and the amplifier are automated, so they just follow the radio. Tuning the radio the way I do it, I'll admit, is a little kludgy. You have to use a combination of tricks. Of course, you can always enter a frequency in the entry window in N1MM. You can click a spot or frequency in the band map, or as we'll show a little later, we use the spectrum window. You can click on a station or a signal shown there or an open frequency. And the mouse wheel controls the RIT when you're in run mode, and it tunes the radio when you're in SMP. And today, those of you who are on the N1MM reflector will know that today I just learned finally how to adjust the tuning rate on that. But nope, There's no big knob at K3AJ remote, and that takes some getting used to. We mostly operate assisted, so that helps too. We send CW and RIDI messages with the F keys, and you can always do Control K to use the keyboard, but we don't have a paddle at K3AJ. It's possible to implement a remote paddle, but it's more software, more hardware. W4RN has done it. It can be done. I just don't want that extra layer of complexity. As far as the audio goes, we run RC4, which is the software provided by remotehams.com, and it has a VoIP audio capability built in, which works pretty well. And it also provides a radio front panel that I'll show you in a little while that can be used as well. So the key software choices involved here, basically you need two pieces of client server type software to do what we do. The first is a remote desktop app to get control of the shack computer. There's lots of options, and I guess most of them would likely work very well. You know, some of the usual suspects are listed here: TeamViewer, Chrome Remote Desktop, AnyDesk, Real VNC. They should all work. Both W4RN and I use Real VNC. It operates through a web service. It's very fast. It's been very reliable. Having reliable audio is the Achilles heel and the key to success. When you're trying to run or pounce on CW, even momentary audio dropouts are killers. Every pop or drop is a repeat, and it doesn't take many of them to make the whole operation too frustrating. Both W4RN and I have tried a few different solutions, and we're both currently using the Remote Hams RC4 as our audio channel. There's a VoIP app built into the RC4 that uses a port forwarding approach, so it doesn't go through any kind of web service. It also, all importantly, has adjustable length buffering, so you can adjust that to get the degree of reliability you want. I'll talk more about that in a minute. Another popular app for audio that a lot of folks are using is the combination of Murmur Mumble. I think one of those is the server, the other is the client. That's audio software that's popular with gamers, but I have not tried it yet. Maybe I will sometime just to check that box off. The other software choices involved, of course, N1MM Plus is our logging software. Early on, one of the things we found is that the lack of a pan adapter display, coupled with the absence of a big knob to tune the radio, made it really hard on the remote ops to do unassisted S&P or to find a run frequency. So I went through several iterations of how to feed the N1MM spectrum window to provide that remotely. And I finally settled on using an SDR Play software-defined radio, which is connected to my K3's IF out. And then that requires a piece of intermediate software called Waterfall Band Map. And that sort of sits in between the SDR and the spectrum window. And I had my fears that this wouldn't be very reliable, or it might bog the operation down with too much computing power, but it's proven to be very stable and very reliable. And it's also got to the point where when I'm operating in the shack now, I find myself looking at the N1MM spectrum window, and I don't even hardly look at my P3 SVGA screen anymore. For station accessories, I use PSD Rotator as my sort of general purpose automation and computer control solution. I use PSD Rotator to control my two rotators, to automate the step IR. Yes, I have a stepper. And also I run a couple of relay boards that provide remote switching of the receive antenna and some other accessories. And there's a lot of different ways to do this. There are a bunch of remote USB or IP enabled relay boards out there that you can use. And of course, N1MM has rotator control already built in, so you could use that as well. Because both N1MM and RC4 need to be connected to the radio, I use EtherLogic's VSPE, Virtual Serial Port Emulator. It sets up as a port splitter. I was a little trepidatious about using that too, but this thing has proven to be 100% reliable. In fact, I just go ahead and leave it running all the time on my shack computer, even when I'm not doing this. and I just let my programs log into that shared port. I'm going to show you what the remote operator sees. So this is what's normally on the shack computer. I have 2 monitors in the shack. On the right, I try to usually just keep N1MM on the right screen, although sometimes I've moved over the amplifier panel so folks can keep an eye on that, or the buttons that move the receive antenna direction. But mostly we keep N1MM on the right. And of course, the remote op can just go ahead and set it up any way they like. They have access to it. On the left are the windows for the amplifier, the 2 rotators, the step-by-R, and the relay board buttons. And you can also see the RC4 server window sitting over there on the left, but that really doesn't do anything when you're operating. If the remote op has 2 screens, he can use both. If he only has 1 screen, VNC puts everything in kind of one long rectangular window with a slider on the bottom, and you can slide your way back and forth across the view of the 2 screens, and that works reasonably well. I mentioned that RC4 does have a radio front panel. Here's what it looks like. Frankly, for contesting, I don't think it's that useful because you have to leave N1MM focus to go fiddle with the radio and then come back again, and it just takes too long. But if you really want to, you can use this to grab the knob with your mouse pointer and spin it. You can access other radio controls if you need to make adjustments, but let's face it, when we're contesting, we're normally not fiddling with the radio all that much. The remote ops normally minimize this window and ignore it. It's probably a little hard for you to see, but interestingly, above the radio panel, there's a long bar, and on the right side, it's got a little bit of what looks like a audio scope graph, and that's the audio channel being shown. And you notice that it gives you, on the left side, it says what the delay is. That gives you kind of a real-time view of the audio latency, and that changes up and down as you're into or out of the buffer length. So that's interesting, but it's not really that important to watch. Here's a diagram that shows all the hardware and software currently in use at my station. 6 months ago, this diagram would have looked differently. And 6 months from now, I got a feeling it's going to be different again. I'm constantly on the lookout for improvements. I've talked about all these components already, so I'm not going to spend the time for that. If somebody wanted to look at this more carefully, I'm sure the presentation will be available to you. And you can see the software running on the shack computer, the 2 clients that run on the remote computer. Within the shack computer, the programs all talk to each other pretty much by UDP, and then crossing the threshold into the computer, they're all a bunch of USB and serial ports. I like to use a Win keyer anyway with N1MM, but when you play the game the way I am, you have to use it because with port sharing, you can't access the DTR RTS lines for CW and PTT and N1MM. And you also notice I like to use a dedicated external sound card between the radio and the computer. What this shows is that all the real complexity, all the work is done at the shack. The remote op just runs those 2 pieces of client software. They're very simple to set up. The remote ops just log in and go. Interestingly enough, both of these apps support multiple logins, which could be a little confusing, but you could actually have more than one op logged in at a time and watch each other. And I've also used this to kind of coach people and teach them some tricks of contesting as they're remoting by playing at the station. So the question is, how does it work? Well, pretty good. You have to have a good internet connection at both ends, of course. The success rate kind of depends on the mode. FT8 and FT4 is a no-brainer. It's really easy because you don't need any audio. You just set up remote desktop and you go. Everything's happening in the shack. RTTY is the next easiest. You need the audio to hear the deedles for timing and situational awareness. But if there are occasional dropped audio packets, it doesn't matter because the decoding is occurring back at the shack. CW is usually reliable. Too many pops and drops, drop packets are a killer, kill the phone pretty quick. At present, the remote ops report they're experiencing maybe a handful, less than 5 drops per hour, but it kind of comes and goes depends on how our internet connections are behaving more than anything else. SSB is really difficult. You've got to get the audio going in two directions. There's extra latency because of the path of the transmit audio. And then the TR switching has to be coordinated with the latency of the transmit audio. So it's a hairball. W4RN doesn't do SSB, doesn't intend to, and I haven't yet got it working at K3AJ, so that's still TBD. W4RN has been doing this a long time, starting at W4BVV. I'm sure there's probably several of you on the call that have played with him there. He's used ops as far away as Korea regularly, and they've scored some very high finishes and some category wins in multi-2 and multi-single with a competitive station and operator team. At K3AJ, we're loud enough to have fun, and that's what we do. You'll note that in some of the contests I report up there, we made a pretty large number of QSOs. So we made over 1,300 and 160, actually both 160 contests, because we did just about the same in the CQ. And we made over 2,200 QSOs in the CQ Worldwide CW. All I can say is if the remote op didn't work well, we wouldn't have made all those Qs. So how does it work? Hey, Bill, I think, is on the call, and he has no idea he's going to be a star of my presentation. I've got a 1-minute recording. I'll play a little bit of it, of K3WA running them in the CWT. So hopefully the audio will work. Okay, I hope you're all able to hear that. So what about the latency? Everybody talks about that, of course, with remote operation. So the time to execute keystrokes in N1MM or anything else via the remote desktop software is pretty minimal. KU7T recently did an exercise where he measured it using the AnyDesk remote software and reported something like 50 or 60 milliseconds. And that's in line with my unprofessional opinion, is that the latency in executing operations is minimal. It's less than 100 milliseconds. Frankly, you don't even notice it. The audio latency is more, and it's really not so much about the time it takes to travel the internet. It's more about how much buffering you need to ensure a reliable audio stream and survive drop packets. We can adjust that in RC4. We were using 300 milliseconds, and recently we've upped it to 400 to get a little better reliability. So the total latency in the audio is about half a second. The remote op hears the audio as a continuous stream, both the other guy he's working and the rig side tone, because remember that's all delayed in the same audio stream by half a second. The QSO partners will hear us come back a half second delayed. And for what we're doing, I mean, that might not be great for somebody who's world class, but for us, it's okay. And it's, let's face it, it's seldom that somebody doesn't wait half a second for a reply. And I will say it's not as bad as waiting on some SO2 op to get to you. SSB, I talked about this a little bit. It's a lot more difficult between two directions of the audio and the need to switch the rig remotely. I think the latency in that could be as much as a full second. And whether that would work in SSB contesting, why that's still TBD. What's on my to-do list at K3AJ? Well, I would like to get it working on SSB. I don't know how often we'll use it, but I just like to be able to prove that we can do it. I don't have my 2-meter amplifier set up really to work in a remote environment yet, so I need to do that. I bought the hardware, and I'm going to play around with the Freak Easy Raspberry Pi based antenna switching thing that just came out that's designed to work with N1MM. One of the things it does that I'd really like to try is that it can automate your receive antenna pointing. As soon as you start typing a call in, it knows the direction and points the antenna. So I'd kind of like to try that. I'm in a place now where I'm trying to bring on a few more ops here and there as station performance warrants. And W4RN has said to me before that he would really like to promote using this kind of software approach as a PVRC standard to allow more and more of our members to share their stations with others. If you'd like a test drive, get in touch with me and we can arrange that. The CWTs on Wednesdays are great opportunities to give it a go for about an hour, and I'd be glad to set that up for you. For those not familiar with my station, here's the capabilities. Like I said, it's not a super station, but we're loud enough to have fun, and that's what we do.